Okay, ladies and gentlemen, what a great honor to have all of you here at the Foreign Correspondents Club of Japan. A full house for a book break for the greatest book writer of our generation here in Tokyo. No, this man right here. Okay. Now, I'd just like to make a couple of quick points before we let Bob get into his talk. First, let us welcome not only Bob, but his lovely wife over here, who spent 25 years with the United Nations. Thank you so much for joining us. Okay, so there are two things I want to say about Bob. First, we have almost the same birthday. He was born on October 4th and 24th, and I on October 26th in 1942. He had more sense than I did, because when he was only 19, he came directly here to Tokyo. You can say that again. Yeah, he came directly here to Tokyo and thereby had a jump on me of 15 years. Can you imagine the 15 years that I lost? I can imagine them now when I read this wonderful book, which is sitting right here. This is, I've read the whole thing cover to cover, and I'm reading it again now because I'm about to write my review. It's a pleasure to reread it after you've read it. This book is a book that I will buy for my relatives and friends back home who say, "Why did you waste your life in Japan, Bradley?" And I'll say, here's the explanation from the master. Okay, so the second thing I'd like to say is the club has had for many years a special rule about how to become a regular member. Okay, originally a regular member was a correspondent member, but at some point they adopted the missioner rule after James Missioner, saying if you're a book author, you can qualify to be a regular member. Have I explained this correctly?
Yes.
So what I'd like to propose here before we let Bob talk is that from now on, when we're speaking of this, we speak of the Missioner Whiting rule. So with no further ado, I'd like to introduce our esteemed guest speaker of the night, Bob Whiting.
Thank you.
Oh, a couple of little things. Wear masks when not eating or drinking, and the book Tokyo Junkie is available at the reception desk, right?
Yes.
Okay, 2,000 yen per copy. Okay, Bob, it's all yours.
All right. Thanks. Can you hear me okay? All right. What I've done is put together a collection of photos tonight, which tell a story. They show the growth of Tokyo from 1962, when I first arrived here, to the present day. During that time, both the city and I underwent a major transformation. And that transformation is the thematic core of the book Tokyo Junkie. Can we go to the first one? All right. No, we don't go there yet. Tokyo was a polluted, fetid backwater when I first arrived. As you can see, Tokyo Tower was barely visible in the pollution from the auto and industrial exhaust. It was so polluted here that everyone wore face masks, and there were oxygen tanks, at police boxes for policemen who were overcome by the smog. I was a 19-year-old GI when I got my first glimpse of the city. Sorry, this is a little tricky system that we've got here. It was unbelievably crowded at rush hour. Was my first impression, as this Tokyo Station photo shows. Platform pushers were needed. Coming from a small town, I'd never seen anything like this. The city was one big construction site in an effort to get ready for the 1964 Olympics. At the time, Tokyo had virtually no modern infrastructure, just narrow roads, old low buildings, and only one five-star hotel, which was the Imperial, which was falling into disrepair. 8 expressways were in the process of being built when I arrived, along with 10,000 new buildings. You could stand in the middle of Tokyo on just about any street, and on one side they'd be tearing down buildings, and on another side they'd be putting them up. The energy of the place was just incredible. There were two new subway lines were also being built. Canals were being filled by underneath the highways. The traffic congestion was terrible. Streetcars had to be removed to facilitate Olympic construction. This was what the Ginza looked like when I first arrived. Only 1/4 of all the residents in Tokyo had flush toilets. Vacuum trucks sucked out the waste from most houses and dumped it in Tokyo Bay. Okay, waste was also deposited in so-called honey buckets for transport to the rice paddies outside the city to use as fertilizer. The city was quite odoriferous at this time. I was assigned to Fuchu Air Station, about 30 minutes from Shinjuku on the Keio line. I was an electronic intelligence analyst working for the CIA, which was making secret U-2 flights over Russia 3 times a week. It was a 45-minute ride by train and subway to the Ginza. 25 minutes on the Keio line, 20 minutes on the Marunouchi subway line. At the time, Life magazine called Tokyo the most dynamic city in the world. The population of Tokyo proper at the time was 10 million, making it the largest city in the world. The population of the greater Tokyo metropolitan area was 18 million, about half of what it is today. Okay, it was said that there were more bars and restaurants per square kilometer in Tokyo than any other city in the world. This photo of Tokyo bar girls by the famous French photographer William Klein is a classic, and it typifies the era. Americans at the time were extremely well liked because of the new president, John F. Kennedy, and his wife, Jackie. Bobby Kennedy visited Waseda here in 1962 and drew enormous crowds. A popular club, a nightclub, was the Showboat in Shimbashi. It was constructed in the shape of a Mississippi riverboat. Scenes in the hit film The Bridges at Toko-ri with William Holden and Grace Kelly were filmed there. The Golden Getsuzekai was another hot spot. The girls were dressed like Playboy bunnies, which was a big phenomenon at the time in the United States. Japanese businessmen took visiting foreign guests there. Everyone was learning English to cater to the expected influx of foreign tourists coming to the games. I spent a lot of time in Shibuya. Oh, excuse me, I'm sorry. The popular figure was Larry Allen, who played the piano at the Golden Gate and Club 88 nightclubs and recorded some record albums in Japan. I spent a lot of time in Shibuya. This is what the famous crossing in Shibuya looked like back then. It's a little different than it is today. A famous street in Shibuya was called Love Letter Alley, where Japanese women could have letters to their boyfriends overseas translated into English and other languages. Happy Valley Dance Hall was another popular spot. The Andogumi ran Shibuya. I was once invited to one of the Andogumi gambling dens. Chohan and Hanafuda were the standard dice and card games run by the gang. Ando Noboru, who you can see sitting to the right of the dealer, later became a movie star, and he starred in films about his adventures as a gang boss. The preparations for the games were frantic, and when I first arrived, you couldn't drink the tap water, and there were rats everywhere, which is why signs like this were needed. But one after another, the Olympic venues went up. Particularly striking was this famous Kenzo Tange's Yoyogi National Stadium. It won the Pritzker Prize for architecture. Also impressive was the Komazawa Olympic Park and Olympic Park Stadium. The Okada and 4 other luxury hotels opened up. Among them, the Hotel New Otani, featured in the James Bond film You Only Live Twice. On October 1st, 1964, the bullet train, the fastest train in the world, also known as the Shinkansen, began operations. The Tokyo Olympics began October 10th that year because it was much cooler and served as Japan's re-entry into the world after defeat in war. Never before had so many foreigners been in the city at one time, except for the occupation when they were not exactly invited. The opening ceremony brought tears to the eyes of many Japanese. The torchbearer was a survivor of the Hiroshima atomic bombing. There were 3 events that stood out for the Japanese in the Olympics. One was the open weight in judo. Dutchman Anton Haysink defeated Japan champion Akio Kaminaga. It was a devastating blow to the national pride because many people had thought that superior technique and fighting spirit could vanquish the much larger foreigner. The second event was the marathon. Kokichi Tsuburaya lost the silver medal in the marathon, a closely watched event telecast on national TV, surrendering a big lead in the final lap around the National Stadium track. Afterward, he apologized profusely. He later committed suicide. The third event was the women's volleyball final. The Japanese women's volleyball team, dubbed Witches of the Orient by a Moscow newspaper, redeemed Japanese pride and faith in fighting spirit. They defeated a bigger, stronger Soviet squad on the final day, thanks to a brutal 11-hour-a-day training regimen. The final point was watched by 95% of the viewing population, a record that still stands. It is regarded as one of the top 10 sporting events of all time in Japan. There was a dark side to the Olympics, however. The bullet train cost so much money, there was not enough funds to buy land to finish the monorail, originally intended to run from Haneda to Shimbashi with a license applied for to Tokyo Station. Instead, it ended at inconvenient Hamamatsucho. The lack of funds to purchase land meant that the highways had to be built over public domain water instead. The pillars planted in the water to support the overhead roadways destroyed marine life in the Kanda River, as well as a traditional Nihonbashi river commerce culture. The famous view of Mount Fuji from the bridge disappeared. Still, central Tokyo had such cachet that the James Bond crew filmed You Only Live Twice there, and it was a huge global hit. Here, Sean Connery is shown filming a scene at the Kokugikan. I guess I should tell the story. The Hotel New Otani people gave the James Bond crew carte blanche to film at the Hotel New Otani. They took down the name Otani and put up Osato Chemicals, and it became the Tokyo headquarters of Evil Spectre Corporation. So in the film, Bond is meeting the head of Spectre in the penthouse at the Otani. And he says, "Where are you staying, Mr. Bond?" And Sean Connery says, "The Hilton." So the No Otani people were very unhappy about that. Okay, next one. Yeah. Okay, this is me. I I took a discharge from the U.S. Air Force in 1965 and found a small apartment in Komagome. I enrolled at Sophia University and taught English to make a living. I taught at a bank in Ryogoku near the Asakusa Temple. My students told me matter of factly of the destruction the B-29 bombers had made in the area. The eastern half of Tokyo had been obliterated. Tens of thousands of people were burned alive. It was mortifying. I like to spend time at Tokyo in Tokyo Izakaya, a great invention that was a combination of British pubs and Spanish tapas bars. Anne Denkin's New York Deli was another popular spot. She insulted her customers in New York jargon. I spent a lot of time at the movies watching samurai films. Ken Takakura was the number one star in Japan at the time. He made 10 movies a year. He and Koji Tsuruta teamed up in several films. Climactic scenes were invariably filled with sword fights and geysers of blood splattered across the screen, all in defense of the honor of the clan. I ate it up. While a student at Sophia, I became an English tutor to the popular Yomiuri Shimbun reporter Tsuneya Watanabe, who taught me in return about political corruption. I went to his house 3 times a week for a solid year, and I got a real education. Watanabe thought that Prime Minister Eisaku Sato was the most corrupt politician in Japanese history. Sato was a man who sent his wife to offer cash payments to Watanabe's wife in an effort to stop Watanabe from criticizing him in print in the Yomiuri. Sato's brother Kishi was an infamous war crime suspect who sold out to the Americans and helped ram through the security treaty extension in 1960, keeping American bases in Japan over massive protests by using organized crime. Here, Kishi is seen having been stabbed by a paid assailant believed to have been hired by a political opponent. The recently resigned Prime Minister Shinzo Abe is Kishi's grandson and Sato's grandnephew. In case you didn't know, it helped to have relatives in politics in Japan. I joined student protests against the war in Vietnam, like this one in Shinjuku. Protests back then were often violent, much more so today. The left was destroyed several years later. In 1968, Tokyo University students commandeered Yasuda Hall, initiating a violent battle with riot police. Students also protested land appropriations to build Narita Airport. Japanese baseball was another passion I developed. I regularly attended games at Korakuen Stadium, sitting in the jumbo stands. Baseball was by far the most popular sport in Japan, and the Yomiuri Giants were by far the most popular team. A favorite player was Sadaharu Oh, who embodied the essence of the martial arts approach to baseball that defined the Japanese game. He practiced slicing strips of paper in half suspended from the ceiling with a samurai sword. Here he's training with Golden Boy Shigeo Nagashima. The samurai-inspired martial arts ethos stressed endless training, development of spirit, and self-sacrifice. It was the polar opposite of the American approach. I was also addicted to the hugely popular anime series Kyoji no Hoshi, about a boy who undergoes brutal daily training under his impoverished day laborer father to become a professional baseball player. From age 10 to age 16, for example, he is made to wear this contraption. It's a special vest called the Devil's Vest, made of steel springs and leather to build strength, so making it extremely difficult to even pick up a glass of water. He is forbidden to remove it, even when sleeping or taking a bath. This is a page from the manga book version. The series and Japanese baseball in general later inspired me to write The Chrysanthemum and the Bat about how the adopted game reflected the Japanese national character and culture. In the end, of course, the boy grows up to become a giant star. In 1968, the Kasumi Gaseki building went up. It had 36 stories. It was the tallest building in Asia, and it was the subject of a hit Toho movie. It inspired a wave of skyscraper construction. It was mostly focused in Shinjuku in the beginning. Shinjuku, in 1969, I joined the editorial staff of Encyclopedia Britannica, which was based in Shinjuku. Shinjuku became a favorite haunt. I'll be back. This is Kabukicho, and you could get anything you wanted in Kabukicho. Okay. At this bar, for example, you could get a bottle of beer served by waitresses dressed in nurses' uniforms who would also take your blood pressure for you. I lived in that's my wife there. Okay, back, sorry. I lived in Higashi Nakano Station and took the Chuo line to work every day. It was 2 stops to Shinjuku. This was my morning rush hour ride. I met my future wife, Machiko. And that's her on a trip to Manila. But I'd also been spending a lot of time at underworld haunts. And I became friends with members of the Sumiyoshi Kai, Japan's leading gang. I had a friend in the gang who looked something like this. Huh? No, this is fine. Stay here. He said when we first met, he was running a baseball betting operation, a baseball pool, and I used to go and make these little bets on the Yomiuri Giants losing. And I had a friend. He said to me, he bought me a beer one night and he said, I'm Okinawan and Japanese don't like Okinawans. You're American and Japanese don't like Americans. So let's be friends. So he took me around and he introduced me to his boss, who liked the fact that I had written my graduate thesis on the Liberal Democratic Party at Sophia. He said, oh, that's great. We support the Liberal Democratic Party. We get out the vote, we raise money for them, and in return, they give us construction contracts. So that was my initiation into Japanese gang life. It was an eye-opening experience hanging out with these people. The next one. They never paid for anything anywhere they went. People were just scared stiff when they walked in. And then I saw my friend, my Okinawan friend, almost beat someone almost half to death in a fight. Angry over, it was a taxi driver who refused to pick him up. And so I decided I ought to back off. And so in 1973, I moved to New York City. I needed to detox anyway from Tokyo to see what living in New York was like. I lived at 68 West 82nd Street in Central Park West, a 4th floor walk-up. Machiko got a scholarship to Case Western Reserve for a master's degree, and she visited on weekends. And I wrote The Chrysanthemum and the Bat here. I sent the first copy of this draft, a copy of the first draft to Darrell Spencer, the former major league player who had played for the Hankyu Braves in Japan. And I flew out to see him, and he took me to the Coors in Wichita, Kansas, and put on his glasses and ordered a big tank of beer. And he was coaching the Coors baseball team. He was in retirement then. And he said, you know, this is the first book I've ever read. But he said, it's really interesting. And among the many interesting observations about Japan, he offered this advice to Americans who go to play there. He said, I always tell them the key to understanding Japan is to think backwards from the way you think in the United States. This means always show up early to practice, never complain, never argue with the coach, Never swing at the first pitch, and don't ever play practical jokes on your teammates because they just don't understand. Do that and you'll succeed. You'll be okay. I wrote a chapter on Sadaharu Oh, who became a national figure in the United States as he approached Hank Aaron's world home run record. He was on the cover of Sports Illustrated. Here he is hitting home run number 756. The guy leaping in the air is Isao Harimoto, the only Japanese player with 3,000 hits in his career. After nearly 3 years in New York, I moved back to Tokyo to work for Time Life. This is what the Ginza looked like on Christmas Day, 1975. After living in crime-ridden New York, I lived during the Travis Bickle taxi driver era, where you had, if you were walking home at night, you had to walk on the outside of the sidewalk because muggers were lurking in the doorways to leap out at you. It was great to be back in a civilized city, I thought. This is a rooftop beer garden in the summer during that era. Machiko and I lived in Riki Mansion that sat next to an adjoining building named Riki Apartments. It was the first Western-style apartment complex in Tokyo. It was built in the late 1950s by the hugely popular and very rich professional wrestling icon Riki Doza. My upstairs neighbor was the iconic Giant Baba, the 6'10" professional wrestler. I could hear him practicing backflips, knocking plaster from the ceiling every night. Here I am working with our cat. And that's me, my beard face, the hippie face. Chrysanthemum the Bat came out in 1977. It was featured in Time magazine. And it was a bestseller in translation called Kikuto Bato. Machiko and I got married. Here we are. Why, thank you. You think it'll last? Here we are at a festival in Akasaka, and this is her family in Omiya. That's her father. With the success of Chrysanthemum and the Bat, I became a freelance writer, and I interviewed many memorable figures like the temperamental Clyde Wright, the former Los Angeles Angels pitcher. He set a record for fines and ejections when he was in Japan. He was nicknamed Crazy Wright by the Japanese press. Another memorable interview was with a Destroyer, a popular foreign wrestler in Japan who appeared on a weekly TV variety show as well. He was more popular than Steve McQueen and Alan Delon. His name was more recognizable than Lockheed Aircraft, embroiled in a national bribery scandal in Japan at the time. Here he is wrestling the great Riki Doza. I interviewed the Destroyer for 6 hours. I made the mistake of asking him if pro wrestling was fake. He responded by putting the figure 4 leg lock on me and nearly broke my leg. Here I am with Roy White, the former New York Yankee outfielder who played for the Yomiuri Giants. Mild-mannered Roy was just the opposite of Crazy Wright, and he was so well liked in Japan, a reporter said to me, "It's too bad he's not Japanese, then he could stay here forever." Giants present manager Tatsunori Hara is off to the right, by the way, here. Leon Lee was another one who was well liked. He said of playing in Japan, "It's different here, sure, and it's difficult with all the practices and regimentation. But when you are invited to someone's house, you don't complain about the decor or the food they serve. You're a guest, be respectful." Here I am with Keio University professor Masato Ike at a ball game in Kawasaki Stadium, which was probably the worst stadium in the entire country. It was so decrepit that the stands were perpetually empty. The seats were rotting and it smelled like urine and whiskey. So nobody wanted to sit out there. Reggie Smith, former Red Sox star, is shown here, who played for the Giants for a couple of years in the 80s. He said the fans shouted racial insults at him while he was playing right field in Koshien Stadium in Osaka. But he said because they could not get the pronunciation right, it just made him laugh instead. Here is Brooke Shields. I tried to get her to go to an izakaya, but her mother wouldn't let her. She was only 16 years old at the time. Okay, next. Here's Greg Davis, who was a good friend of mine. A photographer named Tim Porter sitting next to him, my brother, and there's my wife on the end, trying to look like she's enjoying herself. And okay, go on. It was around this time in the late 70s and early 80s that Japan began dominating global trade with exports of superior cars, cameras, TVs, and other products. It was a time of explosive economic growth known as the bubble era. The 1985 Plaza Accord had effectively doubled the value of the yen against the major currencies. Tokyo was transformed again during this period with new building complexes like Arc Hills popping up. The city was awash in money. Half the cash in the world was in Japanese hands. Expensive foreign cars began to appear on the street. People could eat sushi sprinkled with gold dust. It seemed like one giant party. A famous symbol of decadence at the time was Juliana's Disco, where once demure office girls got up on a giant stage and danced in their underwear in front of their boyfriends. My wife was recruited by the UNHCR around this time and moved to Geneva. We kept our Akasaka apartment, and I began a life of around the world airplane tickets for the next 25 years. Bubble era gangsters acting on behalf of banks forced unwilling Tokyo landlords to sell their properties for redevelopment, forcing many tenants out. In the midst of this, I moved to Kamakura. I published You Gotta Have Wa in 1989, a book about the inability of Japanese and Americans to get along as seen through baseball. Japan was a big topic in the US, and the book was a bestseller there. Here's a book party for Wa. And the next, go on to the next one. And next, here's a train poster. Yeah, train poster. And a subway poster for Wa. There's a Wa hardcover in Japanese and appearance on Larry King. Around this time, Shintaro Ishihara. Go on next. Oh, sorry, excuse me. And here's the feature in the Herald Tribune. Okay, go to Ishihara. Around this time, Shintaro Ishihara, the man who could say no to America, invited me to lunch. I said yes. He was quite impressive. He quoted Balzac and Dostoevsky and ordered expensive French wines at the Capital Tokyo Hotel restaurant. Ishihara was America's fiercest critic, and I had called him the devil in the U.S. relationship in a magazine article for the Shukan Asahi, while terming Akio Morita of Sony the angel. Ishihara's purpose in inviting me to lunch was to convince me that the reverse was true. I found him quite charming, and afterwards he invited me to a political reception, one which required that I make a donation to his campaign of 50,000 yen at the door. So this time I said no. Tokyo Dome was another symbol of bubble era excess. The Yomiuri Giants reported 56,000 fans for every game. I counted the capacity. There were 42,761 seats with room for about 3,500 people standing. I wrote a column about it in the Shukan Asahi, and Yomiuri banned me from the stadium. In 1986, Prime Minister Yasuhiro Nakasone hosted the G7 in Tokyo. It was Japan's great moment in the sun. The Nikkei hit its all-time peak in 1989, 39,000. The top 10 banks were all Japanese. The top 10 banks in the world were all Japanese. Then the stock market began a long, slow descent down, losing 80% of its value over the next several years. I met Nick Sapetti, the main character of Tokyo Underworld, pictured here as a young black marketeer during the occupation. I mean, I love this picture. These guys really look like nasty. These are America's finest soldiers representing the country. And he was 70 years old in 1990. He had made and lost several fortunes, been divorced 3 times, arrested 12 times, deported once. He had close gangland ties, and it was this time I began work on Tokyo Underworld. It was one of the most fascinating interviews I'd ever had. Okay. People talk about the 1990s as the lost decade, but what is impressive with the amount of construction that continually went on in Tokyo, municipal planning was nonstop and the government always found the money. The Tokyo Metropolitan government building known as Tocho went up. It was one of many other notable structures, including Shinjuku Park Tower, which housed Park Hyatt, where Lost in Translation was filmed. Also constructed was the Rainbow Bridge, which offered one of the most impressive cityscape views in the world. Rainbow, here's another view. The Rainbow Bridge connected Tokyo to the new city center being built in Odaiba on reclaimed land. Also connecting the two sides was the Yurikamome train line, which traversed Tokyo Bay from Toyosu to Shimbashi. In 1995, a Japanese reporter told me there were 3 horrible events that year. The first was the sarin gas attack on a Tokyo subway, which killed many people. The Kobe earthquake was the second, which killed 6,433 people. The third was the defection to the U.S. major leagues by Kintetsu Buffalo's pitcher Hideo Nomo. He became the first Japanese player to go there in 30 years. Nomo was a pariah, but only until he became a star in America, and suddenly he was a hero. That's our boy over there beating those Americans, you would hear people say. He helped eliminate the image of Japan that existed at the time as one of faceless people who could only make products. As the writer Midori Masujima put it, he helped Japanese finally become members of the world. In 1999, the book Tokyo Underworld was published. DreamWorks purchased an option, the first of 5 studios to do so. And the translation of Tokyo Underworld hit #1 in Tokyo bookstores. It's advertised here on a train poster. It caused quite a stir, and I was interviewed in several publications. Ginza Machi, the crime boss, the reformed crime boss of Tokyo, whom I wrote about in great detail, was not happy. He sent 2 letters to me, one in Japanese and one in English, claiming that Tokyo Underworld had left him deeply distressed. He said he wanted to meet me at his office. I showed the letters to my editor, and his face turned pale. He said the Japanese language letter had menacing undertones, beginning as it did with the phrase, "We hope to find you in good health," meaning you're not going to be in good health much longer. After some discussion, I decided to meet him with the Kadokawa lawyer and take along the photographer, Greg Davis. But sudden illness in Machi's family postponed the meeting. His wife died, and then he died. So as it turned out, he would be the one who wasn't going to be in good health much longer. His lawyers explained the situation to me. They said that he wanted to be portrayed as a good guy in the movie that he had read was going to be made. He, in fact, had a letter he carried around from Douglas MacArthur, praising him for fighting communists during the occupation. He would show it to immigration authorities in Hawaii whenever he visited, and they would let him in. but ban other Yakuza. The Sumiyoshi gangster Katsushi Murata is coming up shortly. Here we go. Right here. Was also unhappy. This is the man who had stabbed Ricky Dozan, became famous, went to prison, caused Ricky Dozan's death. But we'd put his mugshot in the book. And he complained. He said we'd done it without his permission. He said we'd hurt his daughter's chances of a successful career as a professional wrestler. And he showed up at Kadokawa offices one day and he demanded 2 million yen in compensation. The publisher said no. Murata glared at him and said, well, then be careful on the subway platform going home. Don't stand too close to the edge. You never know when someone might push you. Everyone, this was him at an older age and the suit and tie photo. So after that, I took, go on to the next. So after that, I took different routes home each night for a long time. I made it out alive, fortunately. But back to Tokyo, the building continued nonstop as Tokyo entered the 21st century. The star attraction was Roppongi Hills, which opened up in 2005. However, the layout was extremely confusing. It also became known for drug use and white-collar crime inside. My wife said they should drop a bomb on it. Another new structure was the Kasukabe Tunnel, an underground flood control system in Saitama. Then there were the continual additions to the highway system. After the Olympics, 280 kilometers worth of new highway were added to these Tokyo roads in stages. At present, more than 30 kilometers is planned at present to add, which is quite a contrast to New York or LA, which I don't think they've built a new highway in decades. The Sky Tree, the world's tallest tower, was another addition to the Tokyo skyline. It went up in 2010. Where I live, Toyosu Towers went up in 2009. Here's the view from Toyosu, from the bay at Toyosu. Here's a view of Roppongi Hills and the new city center, Odaiba, the artificial island in Tokyo Bay. On March 11th, 2011, the Fukushima earthquake and tsunami struck. This was the scene in Miyagi City, and here as well. Tohoku towns were overwhelmed. Entire towns were wiped off the face of the earth. This Chiba propane plant explosion took place. It was so powerful that you could see it from the 20th floor of the Irakusho Denki building. March 2020, the coronavirus hits. There's Governor Koike urging people to stay home. Kengo Kuma National Stadium went up. During this time and the 4 years before the Olympics was planned to start, 45 new skyscrapers had gone up. So this construction was relentless. It just never stops in this city. Here the Olympics are postponed. Shinagawa, oh, that's my wife and I, some event. Shinagawa Station, May 1st, 2020, during the first state of emergency. And so over a year has passed since then. A deserted Main Street in Shibuya. Tokyo ranked low on COVID deaths thanks to the natural hygienic practices of the Japanese. So summing it up, here's a view from the Sky Tree. In 2018, TripAdvisor ranked Tokyo the world's leading tourist destination, ranking at the top in several categories, including local friendliness, taxi services, cleanliness, and public transportation. November 2020, a global finance survey deemed Tokyo the most livable city in the world, according to a number of metrics, including COVID-19 health conditions. In 2021, the city was number one in a number of many areas, a number of areas, excuse me, the highest GDP, most populous city, most Fortune 500 global headquarters, cleanest, most efficient, most extensive subway and train system, lowest crime rate, and most Michelin-starred restaurants with twice as many three-star restaurants as Paris. So in the end, in closing, let me say, I'm very glad I'm here and not somewhere else. Thank you.
Wonderful. Wonderful, Bob. Thank you so much. We are open to questions now. Yes, please go to the microphone and identify yourself. And I apologize, I did not identify myself. My name is Bradley Martin. Okay.
Oops. So Bob, thank you for that.
Hi, John.
John Alkire, just a citizen of Japan, born here, family's been here almost 100 years. So I know most of the headlines that Bob has written about. And first of all, just a comment on the book. I thoroughly enjoyed it through Golden Week, and I really paced myself. I didn't want to go through it too quickly. Beautifully written. And where you have a special magic is not just the headlines, which many of us here who are Japanophiles know about, but you really have taken it into a depth and an observation that's just wonderful. So that's the first part. But I have a couple questions. I want to know more about Smokey, the dude in Roppongi.
Right.
So if you could maybe put a little more color into that guy. That's the first one. Wait, I got a couple more. Secondly, you talked about the Nomo effect, about bringing Japanese athletes to the United States, starting with baseball and Darish and all those folks. But right now, Japanese athletes from tennis to basketball are playing on the world stage. Golf, thank you. I mean, let's not forget golf for the golfers. I would submit that a lot of this has to do with no more Saturday afternoons at school, that those athletes who are gifted could have the training that they deserve to be able to become world-class athletes. So that's just a question and a comment on that. And the final, sorry, I got one more, which is about the uyoku. As much as you've spoken about the Sumiyoshi Gumi and all sort of the Zapati, sort of the mafia connections, you have not made one mention about the uyoku that are so prevalent in Japan. I'm assuming that this is off the record for most people here. Yeah. So I'd like to hear your comments on that. That was a lot, Bob. And again, thanks. I really enjoyed the book.
Stay there because I'm going to forget these questions. Let's see. The first one was
First one was thanks. It was a great book.
Smokey was the first question,
yes.
Right?
Because you were going to write a whole book about Smokey, and you just had one or two lines about him, and it just perked my curiosity.
Well, I'd like to live a little while. Don't mind. Smokey was he was in his early 20s. He was from Oklahoma. He was a martial arts expert who had qualified as a substitute for the Olympics. And he was training Olympic athletes in his sport. He was karate and some form of shorty chikembo or something like that. And he was, about my size, but he was very wiry and muscular and had real serious anger issues. I mean, he was as nice as could be one time, and then he'd blow up. And I found a lot of people in organized crime are like that. It's the drugs they take too. Well, they have to stay up until all hours of the morning, so they have to take these drugs. And I mean, methamphetamine, right? Shabu, and then when it's time to go to sleep, they start drinking whiskey and take sleeping pills. And then they wake up around noon and they're so groggy, they need some more methamphetamine to perk them back up. So they're constantly on edge. And so he was like that. And he was working for the Yamaguchi Gumi. In fact, he had moved into the Gumicho's luxury apartment in Roppongi. And he helped clean out one of these places, one of these buildings when the landlord didn't want to move. So he and some other guys just made life miserable for him. You know, they go in there and sit all day and order, you know, a cup of tea or something, and that, or they would leave a dead cat on the doorstep, things like that to intimidate the guy. And he told me all this, and he was going to do it, and he was going to do a book with me. I was seriously thinking about doing it, but then he said, "I want the, you know, the addresses and telephone numbers of all your relatives." And it just so happened that I'd been asked by Warner Books, by Rick Wolf, to write a book about Ichiro the day before. It's really bizarre coincidence. And they offered me a lot of money. So I said, "I'm sorry, I can't do it. I've got to do this project. Maybe, you know, after I finish the Ichiro book, we can revisit this subject." But when he said that, I just thought, oh boy, danger. And he was very unstable, and he was kicked out of the gang for stealing. And then he went back to the States later on. And I don't know. He called me one time. Had to give a speech, and he wanted to know how to give a speech. So I had to coach him over the phone. And I never heard from him again. I wouldn't be surprised if he's in prison somewhere.
In America.
Yeah. He's a very smart guy, very, you know, clean, well-spoken. And he just had this streak of anger in him that which you need if you want to succeed in organized crime. Anyway, so that's that. And what's the other question?
The second one was the Nomo effect, which you talked about, which brought a lot of Japanese athletes to the world stage. And Nomo was a while back, but now between golf and tennis, I mean, at least I would submit that a lot of the ability of the Japanese athletes has been expressed because there's no more Saturday school, that those gifted athletes do have the time to train and go through proper orientation about their sport in the given choice. Would you agree with that, or would you have a comment about that?
Well, in my experience, there's any Japanese athlete in Japan, there's no shortage of practice. And if their Saturdays were, most of these guys, they play on the baseball team or whatever. Saturday, they practice all day anyway. I mean, They practice 6 hours a day after school, and then they have practice and they play games on Saturday and Sunday. So, you know, having school off is irrelevant because they be practicing anyway. I think it's diet and exposure. Overseas, Nomo going and Ichiro opened the doors, and these guys could see. Now, before then, they never really understood the American way of doing things. They thought when Americans complained about practicing too much or the discipline and regimentation, they just say it's another selfish American. But then they saw that there's a different way of doing things, that their American approach has some value. I think, at the same time, the Americans also realized that the Japanese had something to offer with their approach. But these, I think it's partly the exposure that's made them better, that's helped them adapt, both the good elements and reject some of the bad elements. And also diet. When Sadaharu O was on the cover of Sports Illustrated, breaking Sadaharu O's record, he was 5'9", 175 pounds. When Hideo Nomo went to the States in 1995, he was 6'2" and 190 pounds.
Yeah. Later
becoming 250 pounds. And now we have Shohei Ohtani, who's like 6'5" and weighs 220. And he looks like a defensive linebacker or a tight end in the NFL. I mean, the guy is a remarkable athlete. And you just see these Japanese athletes are more savvy about nutrition, about training. They still train about 10 times harder than Americans do, but they're just more sophisticated about it, and they have better diet and more exposure to more sophisticated, high-tech training methods, I think. And the right wing, the Uyoku, I thought I did mention them in the security treaty demonstrations, but the organized crime and right wing, I have to go back and check, but if I left them out, it's because I could never really tell the difference between a Yakuza and a Uyoku, a right winger. I mean, to me, they were one and the same,
Okay.
One was a day job and the other was a night job. So, I mean, that's the whole, you can go into the history, you know, the Kaplan Dubrow book, Yakuza, tells the whole history, you know, what the Dark Ocean Society, Black Dragon, that's, you know, the right wing and the Yakuza have been intertwined since, you know, the 19th century.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right.
I don't want to take up the stage, but you forgot to mention Ban Shuta and the other players in Hoshi no Kyojin Hoshi. Of course, there was Hoshi Hyuma, Omoi Kondakara, Shiren no Michi o, Yuke Yuke Hyuma. But there's Ban Shuta, and there's
Sorry.
Minoru,
I'm
and
sorry.
there's the Kieru Makyu.
I won't do it again.
Who else would like to ask a question? I'll ask one. Here we go. Can you hear me? No? Yes. Okay. The world was going to come to Tokyo for the Olympics, but now it's not going to come to Tokyo. That seems to me, after reading your book, the most regrettable part of it. I don't worry too much about the athletes since I'm not a big sports fan, but I regret that all of these people around the world who might otherwise have come here and experienced this place are not coming. How's my judgment on this? Am I feeling too sorry for the spectators and not sorry enough for the athletes?
No, I don't think so. The whole Olympic experience is to bring not just the athletes, but spectators from around the world. You have this global festival in one place. It's like if the Koshien High School baseball tournament is the closest thing Japanese have to a national festival, then the Olympics is the closest thing that the world has to a global festival. And I've always liked the Olympics. Even I think they would put way too much focus on money, and I think it's so stupid to hold the Olympics in the summer in Tokyo in August. It's just crazy. But that's NBC. NBC won't allow it. You know, there's a reason that the 1964 Summer Olympics in Tokyo were held in October because the JOC told the IOC it's just simply too hot in Tokyo. And now it's 3 degrees Fahrenheit hotter in Tokyo than it was back then. But you know, it is what it is. I think that I'm afraid that the Olympics are going to be canceled. The pressure is mounting. You see more and more editorials, more and more stories from newspapers around the world criticizing the idea of going forward at a time like this. It doesn't look like the government measures, these shutdowns, are doing any good. Their vaccine rollout is pitifully slow. So I wouldn't be surprised on June 1st when this shutdown ends if the government says or the government asked the IOC to cancel the Olympics. So they won't have to do it. I think the Japanese wanted to do it last year, but I think they were afraid to, and it was only after Australia and Canada backed out that the Japanese said, okay, let's drop it. But I think that's what's going to happen. If nothing changes by the end of this month, I think it's the end. You know, Bach gave Abe the option of waiting until 2022 last year in February, March, when they were having discussion about what to do about the 2020 games. And Abe said, no, we want to do it in 2021. So maybe they can still put it off for another year. I don't know, but what a mess it is. I hope they all have good insurance policies.
Questioners. Okay. Well, let me ask you another one then. What is it about Japanese drinking spots that make them so great? I mean, compared with the rest of the year. It's not just alcohol. I'm talking about behind the stations and so on. Yeah, the kinds of places you went to when you first came here. Can you kind of wax eloquent on this subject and tell us what's great about Japanese drinking spots?
Well, I lived in New York for several years, and in New York, drinking spots, there are bars, people always, they keep to themselves or their little groups. And but in Japan, in these izakaya, it's like one big family. I mean, everyone is friendly. Part of that for me, when I was a student and later a salaryman, was that the Yomiuri Giants game was on TV every night on national TV. I'm serious. And there was every izakaya had a TV on, and every evening in the summer you went in and there were the Giants on. They'd be on there for 2 hours, and people went in not just to have a beer, but to see, so they could watch the game at the same time. And you could, I learned early on, you could make friends with Japanese by asking them about, say, Kyojin kachimashita ka? Kyojin ima katteru? Oh, home run uchimashita ka? And it's a way of striking up conversation. So there's this really, almost family-like atmosphere in izakaya. It's very cozy. And also, I just like, walking down the street and where you have all these signs, for the izakaya sticking out. It's like they're pulling you in. It's just, yeah, it's really cozy. It's
Good. Tell us some more about the Yakuza. I used to know a lot of Yakuza back in my day, but I didn't know them as well as you knew yours. I did once participate in an induction ceremony for a new Oyabun up in Yamagata.
wow.
But I cannot beat your stories. But give us a few more. How are the Yakuza today compared with the past in terms of theater?
Oh, well, boy, what I I think when I was a student and working, living in Higashi Nakano, and working for Encyclopedia Britannica, the the image of the Yakuza was quite romantic because of the Takakura Ken and the Koji Tsuruta movies. The story was always the same. The Oyabun would be shot in the back as he's walking home one night. And so Takakura Ken would have to go take on the whole gang because the police were corrupt, and he'd have to do it himself. So he'd invariably say goodbye to his wife, and then he'd pick up his sword and he'd walk down the street, across the bridge to the other side, and the cherry blossoms would be falling and the music would be playing this mournful elegy. And then he'd go in and he'd slide open the shoji door and he'd say, "Shinde moraimasu," you're going to die. And then he would go in and he'd get stabbed a few times himself, but he'd basically take care of everybody. And then the cops would take him away, and he'd have to go to prison for several years. And then the next movie you saw, he'd be getting out of prison and coming back, and let's do the whole thing over again. But then there was a director named Fukasaku who made this series of movies about how Yakuza weren't like that, really. They were very nasty people, who would turn on you in a second, for a bag of methamphetamine. What was the type, this famous series, Jingi Naki? Is that it? Jingi Naki Tatakai, is that it, Peter? Yeah. I mean, that stuff, the whole image of Yakuza changed with that. And these days the police have been made a point of de-romanticizing the Yakuza. It made it very difficult. If you're a member of an organized crime gang, you can't even have a bank account. You're not allowed to have one. You can't even become, if you're an ordinary person, you're not supposed to be be friends with the Yakuza. If you associate with them, the police can make life miserable for you. I mean, crime still goes on, but when the Olympics started, just before the Olympics, there were 180,000 Yakuza in Japan. And then the police, they put out this flyer to the gang bosses, and they said, but all these gangsters with unpleasant looking, scary looking faces, please leave the city and go to the mountains or the beach for the Olympics, because we don't want the tourists to think that Japanese all look like this. And then afterwards, they cracked down on it, and the number went from 180,000 to 90,000, and now it's down to 25,000. Is that right? 25,000? I mean, crime hasn't gone down that much. So there's criminals are still active, but the whole idea of, back then there'd be the gang office would have its compound outside, and you could go in and have a cup of tea and talk to the Oyabun, but not anymore. It's quite different.
Story. I have a question from the Zoom chat. Go ahead, read it.
Yeah.
Can you hear me? It says, it's from Peter Scribe. He says, "Hi Bob, just love Tokyo Junkie. Is there anything that just didn't make the book? Can you mention something that you seriously considered for the book but excluded it for some reason? Only if it's possible."
Oh, lots of stuff. My 6-hour interview with a destroyer, I wanted to put in there. I had to cut that down quite a bit. I had a lot of stories for the Cannon Agency. Was this black ops group that operated during the occupation that kidnapped communist spies. I had interviewed the two remaining agents. They were still alive. One of them died, but one of them is still alive in Arizona. And they were, were snatching people off the streets and keeping them, prisoner. Their office, their headquarters was the old Iwasaki house in Ueno. And the whole idea was that the Americans were afraid that this wave of communism that had represented by Mao taking over in China and the Korean Peninsula splitting into two states, North Korea becoming a communist state, was going to, the next stop was Japan, and they were worried that they wouldn't be able to stop it. So they turned to the Cannon Agency to start this black ops group. And one of the things they did, there were 26 people in the group, and they hired Japanese Yakuza to work with them from the black market. So were mostly Koreans, and the Yakuza, Korean Yakuza could tell. They all had relatives in the peninsula, and they could tell which ones were communist sympathizers and which ones were sympathizers with the South. I mean, which ones had relatives in the North. Because if you had relatives in the North, you were automatically communist. I mean, that was just the way it was. And they had... they learned that the North Korean government, Pyongyang, was manufacturing pure heroin, and they were trying to sell it in Japan. They had a twofold goal. They were going to, they wanted to addict as many GIs as they could to heroin, so they wouldn't be able to fight the war in Korea that was coming. And secondly, they wanted to raise money for the Communist Party in Japan. So Cannon, he was this Texas Border Patrol agent who was an explosives expert and who became friends with Willoughby, who was the head of the G2 intelligence wing in the occupation. They both spoke German, had Prussian relatives. And he'd recruited some Korean American agents from San Diego. And they got this boat and put some tattoos on, and they pretended to be Yakuza, and they sailed to North Korea, and they talked to the North Korean government. They posed as the Yakuza gang, and they said, we want to, import some heroin into Japan, can we make a deal with you? And so some weeks later, Al Shattuck was this American guy who was one of the top ranking guys in the Cannon Agency. He had this a boat in Yokohama, and his job was to go out to the mouth of Tokyo Bay, where this North Korean fishing boat would drop off this drugs in a flotation device, and there were several 1 kilogram aluminum containers with heroin inside, and there was the label Red Lion on top of it. And they took it back to this warehouse, and they took it out and packaged it, and it was so powerful. It was 99.9% pure heroin that they got stoned just trying to package it and keep it. And he said after a while, the North Koreans got smart because no money was coming back, and no GIs were being addicted to heroin. So their job became seeking, these shipments out. And so they would try to intercept these boats, or these shipments were offloaded on a beach out south of Yokohama. And there'd be a lot of, shooting incidents. And, they had infiltrated these North Korean gangs, and they were sending, they decoded the North Korean code, and they were falsifying messages and telling them to arrive at such and such a time, at such and such a place, and then they'd arrest them. And it turned out that in the end, heroin there were some GIs who got addicted to heroin, but I mean, most of them who were going to fight the war had been transferred to the South Korean peninsula anyway. But it turned out that Japanese didn't like heroin because it made them too lethargic. They wanted something in which they could work, 20-hour days. And so the North Koreans started manufacturing methamphetamine, crystal meth. And, it became a huge hit. And that's where they started dropping off in these fishing boats, off the shore. And so the people who needed who wanted the drugs were the construction workers who had to work all night, the nightclub workers, the taxi drivers, those kind of working class people who really needed to be able to focus. I mean, if you're a taxi driver, you've got to work, like these insane 36-hour shifts or whatever they are. So that's how methamphetamine became popular, and the North Koreans are still doing it. I mean, they're still to this day. I mean, the Chinese and the Mexicans have supplanted them as far as drugs go, but the North Koreans are still supplying drugs to Japan. There are over 1 million methamphetamine users in this country. Anyway, that's a great story. But the thesis of this book, the algorithm that Rick Dyke and I were discussing, is about a relationship between me and this city. And so I had to cut all this stuff out that really didn't advance the relationship, the growth of the city and the growth of me. There's, some stories about the right wing, for example, which didn't make it in. Sports, the Kyoji no Hoshi story was what I just described was the first year. It went on for several years. I could have written a book on Kyoji no Hoshi. So there's so much material. I have enough for another book. I don't know if I have the energy to do it, but anyway, any other questions?
Well, I can't help getting back to the Encyclopedia Britannica. Now, that's a less romantic part of the book, but you were making your living there. Frank Gibney was a stalwart in this club back in the day. So, and a lot of people might remember him. But how was Encyclopedia Britannica making its money here in Japan? That people would enjoy that story, I believe, Bob.
Well, they were selling $800 English encyclopedias to Japanese families. They had this core of salesmen, several hundred salesmen around the nation. Maybe it was bigger than that. Maybe it was over 1,000. But they would go into a home and they would convince the mother and that, you know, if they had these English encyclopedias in the house that nobody could read, that by osmosis, this would help their kids get into Tokyo University. And they were enormously successful. I remember there was one salesman was arrested in Kobe. He went to this house and, you know, the wife said, well, my husband's not home. He doesn't come home until late. So he showed up at midnight when the husband's home now, and the husband was there, and he was, you know, not entirely sober. And he pushed them to buy this encyclopedia, and they called the cops, and the police came and they arrested the guy. And while he was in the Kobe jail, he sold 2 sets of encyclopedias to the guards. And he made he was salesman of the month in Britannica. So, you know, you go into the salesman's office, and their office was in the Meiho building in Tokyo. And these guys had, I mean, really expensive Rolex watches and gold tie pins, and just, you know, reeking of money and bragging to each other about the new car that they bought. But because of that arrest, there was it became a big story, and so they didn't sell as much after that. So they had to start selling other types of programs, for, you know, language courses for adults and kids that people could actually use. And that's where I came in. That was my job, writing that stuff. It was quite something. It's amazing when you think about it. They could sell $800 was a lot of money back then for Japanese. And people would buy it. Yeah, they'd have these encyclopedias that would sit in their living room and nobody would ever open them. It looked nice.
Have a microphone.
Michio Nakamoto, not so active freelance journalist.
Yes.
Tokyo and Japan have changed quite a lot since you first came here. Are you happy with the way things have gone?
Yeah, I am. I think what the people who built this city have done is just remarkable. It just blows me away. How I mean, look at this place. It's just compared to New York City. I mean, the subways are so clean and safe and efficient. You know, 20 seconds before you come into the station, this melody starts playing, and oh, here we are in Shinagawa. Well, in the 60s, I think the Japanese had a lot more energy, but they had reason to have a lot more energy. And the student movement was really impressive then. And I mean, these demonstrations were really violent, and you just don't see that now. I mean, I knew guys who wound up in jail just for fighting with the police. But and TBS used to have this Saturday afternoon program where politicians would come to the studio and they would debate with these student leaders from Waseda and Keio. And it was really impressive stuff. I mean, these kids really knew, I shouldn't call them kids, but young adults, they really knew their subjects and they knew how to debate. And you just don't see that these days. You don't see that kind of commitment or energy. You know, the left was destroyed by the police, and you know, after that Karuizawa incident on the Lod Airport, and so there really is no left in the sense that there was during the 60s. But on the other hand, I think Japanese people are far more sophisticated now than they were, internationally speaking. The 60s, 70s, 80s, everybody wanted to go to Europe or the United States. But I think people have come to the realization that this place is just as good, if not better, than anywhere else in the world. So why go? You know? That's the sense that I get. There's a new level of sophistication and contentment, I think. As far as the Japanese people go, I'm really impressed. The politicians are just as crooked as ever. You know? I write about this in the book. You know how people always wonder how is it that the ordinary Japanese is so honest. Now, how many millions of dollars or hundreds of millions of dollars did they return after the Fukushima earthquake and tsunami? People lost cash; they turn it in. I left a wallet with 100,000 yen in cash in the Yokosuka line, and it came back to me in the mail with a note saying, "Be careful of your wallet." I mean, that's just really impressive. That's a great thing. And then these politicians, you just one bribe after another. Abe, I can't believe how this guy Aso Taro is still finance minister. The guy is. I mean, he should be in jail. You know, that finance official had committed suicide, and his wife is suing the government now. And it's just one, you know, the Hiroshima guy who's buying votes. It's just a constant stream. It's been like that since I first came. It's just, and I'm not exactly sure. Some people say it's a feudal hangover where people, you know, have this obeisance to authority, so they don't question it, and so the officials think they can get away with anything. I don't know, but it's this country succeeds despite its politicians. The greatest strength Japan has is its people, ordinary people.
It looks like we need to wrap it up now because it's 5 minutes to 8 and we're supposed to finish up at 8. So I would like to present a bottle of real wine. When's the last time you tasted any of that, folks? To our, we can't give him an honorary membership because he is a member. So here you go, Bob. Thank you so much. Here's a bottle of real wine. Wonderful presentation. I'd like to make a couple of announcements. One, the next book break is on a book, Poisoning the Pacific, the U.S. military's secret dumping of plutonium, chemical weapons, and Agent Orange by John Mitchell. That will be on Wednesday, June the 16th. And let us hope that by then we can have some actual booze with our dinner. We can only hope. Another thing I'd like to say is I see a number of people here who used to be members of the club. I would like to point out to you that our new chefs are great. If you will come in the daytime at lunch and order the fish, you will see that this is absolutely world-class cuisine. So please think of coming back and joining the club again. And those of you who never joined, think of doing it now because we are on a roll. We have a great food and beverage team, and we have great events going on here in the club. And we really need more of you to come and join us. Thank you. We will see you next time.